A recent article in Scientific American said that there are over 325 theories of consciousness. Today we're discussing one of them, illusionism. Welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Keith Frankish. He's a philosopher of mind and originator of the term illusionism with regard to a particular theory of consciousness. Keith, why don't we start with you telling me what your understanding of what consciousness actually is?
It is a question we have to ask. I think many people think we know exactly what consciousness is because we are conscious, and in being conscious, we have perfect knowledge of our own consciousness. So they think the question is unnecessary. Everyone knows what consciousness is. Ned Block, the philosopher Ned Block, quoted, I'm not sure that it was Louis Armstrong or Fats Waller who said, he was talking about jazz, if you have to ask what it is, you ain't never going to get to know. But I would say as a general formula that consciousness is whatever our best theory of consciousness says it is.
Mm-hmm.
So if you asked what the sun is, well, you could point to it and say, well, it's that, whatever that thing is. I suppose I could say consciousness is whatever's occurring in me now. Okay, that's pretty uninformative. Okay. But if you want to know what the sun is, you need to study the sun using appropriate instruments, and you need to construct theories about it that integrate it with our knowledge of other phenomena and so on. And I think the same goes for consciousness. Just as it goes for memory, emotion, other bodily systems that we wouldn't regard as mental, like, say, the immune system or the digestive system, for that matter. Just because we have a digestive system, we don't know what a digestive system is.
But we can distinguish between a label and a theory of how something works. I mean, I can say what's the kidney, and everyone knows what the kidney is, and you don't need to be a nephrologist to understand what a kidney is. So why can't we do the same with consciousness? We can say what it is, and then separately we can say how we can account for it. Why is it not so simple?
Well, with some things it is relatively simple, and because we can point to them. Because it's not perhaps so easy to point to the kidneys. You might need to do some bit of anatomy to point to a kidney, but point to the sun, certainly point to a star, and say that's a star, and a wide range of theories of what stars are. Ancient astronomers thought they might be. I think one theory was that there were little pinpricks in the
canopy.
In the canopy, and the light was coming through the little pinhole. So a very different view of what they are. With consciousness, though, it's not so easy. Where am I supposed to point? And how can you say we both point at consciousness? How can we know we're pointing at the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, some people say that it's intuitive. You know, it's some people say it's the most intuitive thing. Maybe the only truly intuitive thing is the voice inside you that says "I." This feeling of you being inside. They would say that we don't need to get into theories to start talking about what we're talking about, but you're challenging that.
That's the fundamental point I want to challenge. And here's the rationale for that, if you like, that we are parts of a natural world. We have no more direct insight into our own nature than we do into the nature of any other aspects of the natural world. So I have senses that tell me about the world around me, and they give me some useful information about that world, but they don't give me deep insight into its nature. Okay, so I identify things by their colors, but they don't tell me about the nature of color, at least insofar as I think of it as a primary quality, a quality of surface to reflect on light of certain wavelengths. And similarly, I think we are ourselves part of the natural world, and so we know about ourselves through inner senses of some kind, or inner monitoring mechanisms of some kind. We are not something distinct from the physical world. We're not distinct from our physical bodies. And insofar as we know anything about ourselves, we know it through those bodies monitoring their own activity in some way. And that monitoring, that self-awareness, is as liable to be selective and distorting and to introduce illusions as our perception of the world around us is. They're on a par. Or perhaps even our external senses, exteroceptive senses, are perhaps more reliable. If you think from an evolutionary point of view, it's more accurate to be sure whether a predator's coming for you than it is to know exactly what mood you're in.
So what you've done, and I have no problem with you doing it, but just to clarify, you've started with the starting point as we are in the natural world, meaning the physical world, which I don't think anyone can deny. And therefore, you're kind of building up towards saying that that will take us towards this thing which we call consciousness. But of course, there are other people who say, no, we can say that we are in a mental world, and therefore we are now positing kind of mental stuff, another world, a mental world. They assert that in the same way as, you may start from. What do you say about that assertion?
When I say it, I'm not making an assertion as in the sense of saying something that I'm going to dogmatically hold on to. Come what may. It's not an item of faith. It just seems to me the simplest view of taking account of everything that I've read, everything that I've studied, the science that I've absorbed, metaphysics that I've absorbed, and so on. It seems to me the most economical, the most coherent view of what we are. Now, I don't say for a moment that it's the only view that could be true. I can grant you that there are other ways of conceptualizing ourselves, other ways of theorizing about ourselves. I just think this is the one that strikes me as being the most, to have the virtues we look for from a good theory, the elegance, economy, explanatory power, simplicity, and so on.
Can I just ask you,
Yes.
so are you saying that we don't need to invoke a kind of mental substance at all because we can explain it fully using material explanations, and that's sufficient? You're kind of taking it almost like a very scientific approach to this question of whether there is a mental domain that's separate to material domain.
Yes, I'd say that I don't want to deny the usefulness of mental terminology, but I'd see it as describing aspects of the embodied organism
So it's
rather
not a
than
different
describing
ontological kind of.
not having a different ontological category. No. I mean,
I mean, that's quite.
okay.
That's quite. In the realm of philosophy, that obviously is against many of the prevailing thoughts down the centuries. Why do you think it was so obvious to other philosophers of mind, etc., that there was a different ontology for mind?
Now this is a really interesting question, and we get into intellectual history and all sorts of cultural history, and which I'm not an expert on.
So you think it was maybe inherited rather than they didn't start from first principles in the same way as we.
No, I think philosophers tend to present things as if they're derived from first principles, but that's an articulation of a position they've adopted for all sorts of reasons. Many of them perhaps not explicitly articulated to themselves. The inference that we're doing here is probabilistic. It's what theory fits the data, the observational data.
So we're talking about inference to best explanation. Is that what you're
Yes,
talking
abduction. Yes, exactly. And
about? Right. Okay.
which one you're going to light on is going to be shaped by your prior probabilities you assign to the different options, and that's going to be shaped by all sorts of things, many of them of which are not fully aware. And that goes for me as much as for any of them. I freely admit that's the characteristic of the individual inquirer. They can modify these, and they should modify them if they have good reason to. And let me, maybe, I don't know if this helps. Before the development of Darwin developed his theory of natural selection, the influence from the presence of design in nature to an intelligent creator was a pretty good one. Because I think, Richard Dawkins admits this, I think, in The Blind Watchmaker in the early chapters, it is obvious that animals are really complex systems that are well adapted to the particular environments they live in. And so they are, in that sense, designed. Where could this design have come from? No one had any idea. So the only model we had for the creation of design was the sort of creation of design we do, intelligent design. So it must have been some intelligent design of the whole world. It's not a bad inference at all, given that there were no other alternative explanations available. As soon as Darwin put evolution by natural selection on the table, you had a different. He didn't deny the design. This is the crucial thing. He didn't deny that there was design in nature. He gave an alternative explanation of how it could arise, which didn't require intelligence. That reshaped the whole worldview of people who'd took it on board and appreciated its power.
Okay, so let's really hone in now. What exactly do you understand by what other people call consciousness? What we generally understand. What actually is it in your understanding?
Let me just backtrack a little. And I suggested that the origins of this, we're talking about a dualism of mind and body. Okay? I suggest the origins were cultural, but I also think there's probably some psychological basis to these intuitions that arises from the way in which the nature of our self-awareness, the way in which we can uh, um, we represent our own mental activity to ourselves, if you like, or the way in which our brains represent their own activity to themselves, to other brain systems, putting it rather crudely. I think there's something about that, something about the way we get information about ourselves, about our own, let's call it broadly, mental activity, when I'm not understanding that as something distinct from brain activity, that at least makes a dualist conception seem, I don't think it forces it upon us, but it makes it very easy for us to adopt once it's articulated. It seems compelling once it's articulated to us. I'm not saying that everyone, I mean, Paul Bloom argues that maybe they're intuitive dualists, maybe they are, I don't know. But there's something about the way in which our brains track their own activity that makes it tempting for us to think of ourselves as distinct from our bodies. So an example of the kind of approach I'm thinking of is Michael Graziano's attention schema theory. He thinks that the brain needs to control its own attention mechanisms. So letting attention just wander all over the place. So what it needs is some model of how attention works. But it doesn't, in order to control something, you need to be able to model it. Okay? But it doesn't need to model it in great detail. It just needs to have a kind of schematic representation of its own attentional processes that is sufficient for control purposes. So it models them in highly abstract terms. So it treats attention as a sort of something like a sort of ray that emanates from us and latches onto things in the world and grasps information about them and presents it to us. And sort of as if our mind is actively like a beam sweeping across the world and taking in stuff and presenting that directly to us. And he thinks that, which is an evolved mechanism for the control of attention, is one of the sources of our sense that we have that our minds are something non-physical. Because how could something physical be doing this? How could something physical be reaching out beyond us and grasping information and sort of magically presenting it to us? Nothing physical could be doing it. And indeed, nothing. It isn't something. That's just a caricature of the physical processes that are actually involved. So it's caricaturing its own activities for the purposes of control. And this is the sort of line I think we need to go down to think about consciousness and why we have these intuitions about it, why we're tempted to think that we are something separate from our bodies.
So you would then go on to say, I'm guessing, that these intuitions we have are actually incorrect. I mean, the brain has given rise to a way of self-monitoring that almost tricks itself into thinking that it's something different to what it really is. Is that correct? And if so, why would it do that? I mean, say from an evolutionary perspective, why would it do that?
There are two possible routes you can go here. One is that it's just a side effect. It needs to take the attention schema. The brain needs to model attention in a schematic way in order for control purposes. And a side effect of that is when you have creatures with language and a certain amount of capacity for reflective thought, that model tends to induce them to adopt a dualistic conception of themselves. It's not in itself, the dualism isn't actually sort of built into the model. It's just that when you start to think about your own mental processes, you're kind of tapping information from that model in some way. And that's leading you to favor theories that, explicit theories that are dualistic. So it's, on that view, it's just a side effect of a process that was entirely adaptive. Another view, which my friend Nicholas Humphrey has argued for, is that this misrepresentation, this systematic misrepresentation, is itself adaptive, highly adaptive. And I mention his wonderful book, Soul Dust. It's a work that is clearly rooted. The opening chapter makes it clear that he's a physicalist, that he's a Darwinist, that he sees that it looks to evolutionary explanation for the insight into our nature and so on and so on. Makes that very clear. But then he goes on into this wonderful celebration of consciousness, of how wonderful it is. And its wonder is an impression created by evolved neural systems, precisely to make us feel special, precisely to make us feel that we have a richer engagement with the world around us, that the world somehow, that we are making the world come alive with our own responses to it, with our own. Nick has a story about the nature of these responses, and that he then has a list of various benefits that having this sense creates. That it enriches our sense of our own value and of the value of others.
But we have to find evolutionary benefits, not just kind of psychological benefits. There has to be something which would have
Oh,
a reproductive benefit. So
oh yes,
presumably
yes,
there's a
yes.
link from those psychological benefits to the
Oh,
reproductive.
absolutely, yes. He thinks this makes us more tenacious of life. That we're not just
Makes life worth living and breeding for.
experiencing the world. We're able to appreciate the world in a new way. The world is imbued with significance and meaning that we are projecting onto it, if you like. And that's a view that I share. That I'm developing it in a somewhat different way, slightly different
But
way.
if you can get to that point where you
Mhm.
can talk about we as, experiencing kind of
Mhm.
individuals,
Mhm.
you're kind of talking about a very similar thing to what people who talk about kind of different world of mind are talking about. You're just saying that you're wrong to say it's mind, it's still matter. But at the end of the day, we're actually talking about the same thing.
Uh,
At that
uh,
level, the level obviously you can describe things at different levels.
yes.
And the level that once we get to that point where we're saying that, well, if you follow it down, that this was that our what we call consciousness, this experience of ourselves, is all derived from brain functions, essentially neuronal functions, and then higher levels of organization
Mhm.
and self-awareness. But once you then get to the point where you're saying about enjoying life
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
experiencing life and giving purpose and value to life,
Mhm.
now we're talking about the same thing. The argument is then just about what the origin is.
What the nature of it is. Come back to the thing I mentioned earlier. Darwin didn't deny the existence of design. He gave us a different understanding of what design is, that it doesn't require an intelligent designer. And this is a theme throughout the work of Daniel Dennett, who's a mentor, friend, and I think one of the most important philosophers of my lifetime. He's often caricatured as being someone who denies consciousness, denies free will, denies intentionality, perhaps. No, he doesn't. He offers us a different account of what they are. He invites us to rethink them. He doesn't say that we don't have free will. He's quite insistent that we have autonomy and that it's very important to develop autonomy. He just denies that it is something that is uh, that is unconstrained by the causal
Yeah, not
workings of the
supernatural
world.
in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's supernatural. He gives us an alternative account of how freedom evolves in his word, how creatures build up have acquired mechanisms of self-monitoring and self-modification, self-control. That they've autonomy isn't just a free will. It's not a sort of gift from like a divine or metaphysical gift. It is something that evolution has built up and worked on, what we've heard. And indeed, in the individual case, the case of individual development, Dan thought that the development of personal autonomy was a very important process. You don't just take for granted that you have free will. If you don't, that's an Aristotelian point. You need to work at it. You need to work at the self-discipline that is required to be genuinely autonomous and not pushed around by other people. But that doesn't require supernatural free will. It requires developing habits and skills of self-regulation, of self-motivation. That's what makes you free. So in a way, it's a more robust account of free will. It's not just, oh, we have this magical thing that allows us to override the causal processes in our brains. No, it's that we have to train ourselves to acquire the habits and motivations that make us genuinely autonomous. Now, I would say something parallel about other things about value, about emotion,
Or morality
about
as well, maybe.
consciousness, morality.
Mm.
These are achievements. They're things that have a basis in evolved adaptations and in cultural and in processes of cultural evolution. We've acquired scaffolding frameworks, theoretical frameworks that help us to articulate and a certain vision of ourselves and how we and our relation to the world, and by personal individual development, putting these things into practice and learning to do them. So it's sometimes in a we talk to religious people, I just say that for me, it's all about works, not faith. And that the idea of free, metaphysical free will or irreducible consciousness, whatever, or intrinsic meaning, these are just like, it's just like a sort of faith. It's just something that's just present and supposed to do all the work, but there's no account of how it does the work.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's kind of filling in what you would call a God of the gaps, but before it was for design, and now it's for something which we thought must have come from, a supernatural origin. It completes the picture, basically. The full human existence, both the physical, the mental, even up to what we call consciousness, can be accounted for. There's an alternative explanation there. Okay, that's fine. So what are the lines of evidence? Like, now we're talking science. What are the lines of evidence that support this idea that these highest levels of who we are as humans are material in origin? Because
Well,
so far it's a competing idea. So we've got a theistic idea and we've got a materialistic idea, but with inference the best explanation, now we're going to hold them both up in the light of different evidence and see which one, why one is more convincing than the other.
well, first of all, I would say something general at the beginning, that I don't think if you like, the metaphysical one or the theistic one really is really a theory at all. It's just a stipulation that we don't need to explain this because it's just given. Okay, so it's not really even in competition as an explanation. If you believe in a divine creator, then you have unlimited explanatory resources, or you can just say God arranges it that way. You're not in the same project at all of that scientists are in. And I will use science here quite broadly for all kinds of investigation of the natural world that follow this abductive principle. So I don't see it even as a competitor. It's just you have this worldview, you have um, this theistic worldview, and it gives you these resources. And yes, of course, you can deploy them. And I've nothing really to say against somebody who wants to do that. I'm saying is, my point is, if you don't have that, and you're asking yourself, do we need it to explain something? Is there something that can only be explained by invoking this essentially miraculous? Put it like this: if you're genuinely interested in explanation, rather than in reconciling belief in reconciling a theistic worldview with the data of science, then I don't see any need to posit it.
Okay,
Now,
I
of course, you may say,
understand.
well, you
Yeah.
may say then, well, okay, so how do we explain God? Well, it's an ongoing project. We're in the very early stages. We're still sketching extremely rough outline theories. I have my own, which I call reactivity theory. Um, what I protest against is the people who sort of declare that we don't even need to do this exploration because they can tell right now that it can't work because of their intuitions about the nature of their unconscious. They can tell that avenue is closed. Well, now, I may not have made given a detailed, compelling explanation. I'm just asking, I'm recommending that we go on trying to find one.
So basically, are you talking about the people about the hard problem of consciousness, where people just say it's irreconcilable? How can we possibly explain it? Therefore, there must be two worlds. So you're saying
Yeah.
the hard problem of consciousness isn't a problem at all. It's a
Yes.
fake problem.
Yes, exactly. Precisely. You've put it very well. Dennett used to ask another question, which he called the hard question. He actually articulated this, I think, 3 years before David Chalmers articulated the hard problem. The hard question is, what happens then? What happens when a bit of perceptual information has become conscious, has entered consciousness? What does it do? What effects does it have? What psychological effects, behavioral effects? How does it change you? Okay. Now, if it doesn't have any effects, then it's hard to see how this can be how we're talking about the same thing that we think we're talking about when we talk about experience. Experience matters. It affects us, right? I mean, pain it affects us. It changes us. It matters. Okay. So if it doesn't have any effects, then we're talking about some chimera. If it does have effects, then those effects are what really matters. And if those effects could be achieved without the entry into consciousness of the non-physical qualia or whatever, then that would be just as good.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Even by calling it consciousness,
Yeah,
you kind of set up a dichotomy which you're saying isn't justified.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
This is why I say that you.
But there are hundreds of and thousands of philosophers who've dedicated their whole life to the issues, and you're basically saying it's not an issue. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't questions to be asked. Of course, there are many questions. You spent your life and Dan spent his life answering. But you're saying reconciling these two worlds is not an issue. It's not. These are worlds which we have created.
Yes, and so there is an issue here, which is how have we created these?
Yeah, that's an
these
interesting issue,
perceptions?
but that's really
Why?
a brain question, isn't it?
Well, that tends to make it sound more, as it were, more reductive than it need. I mean, we can talk about different levels of organization. Okay, and so talking about the level of neuron firing is perhaps not going to be very illuminating here. Just as talking about the electrical circuit, electroactivity within my computer isn't going to be a very enlightening account of what my computer is doing for me. We need to talk at higher levels of organization, of higher levels of function, and hierarchies, and all sorts of things.
But here's the question, though. The challenge then for a materialist is that at some point we do have to explain how neurons go up to these very high levels, which, the field can't dodge that question because we're trying to get a connected explanation from start to top.
Absolutely. We want
So,
to.
yeah, so the challenge that people say, and I've been quite surprised when they say it actually, but they say there's no possible way that you can go from a computer, a few neurons to these things. It's obvious. I've heard Bernardo Kastrup say the same thing. You can keep making as big a computer as you want, it will never feel. Well, are you saying that's just an assertion with no ground whatsoever?
I'd say I don't think there's any rational. Well, I think there may, as I said earlier, it may be a theory that appeals to us because of the ways in which introspection works. Okay, the kind of access we have to our own mind/brain processes. Okay, so there may be features of how we track our own mental engagement with the world. I don't like using the dichotomy of mind and brain. I like to say mind brain or whatever, or psychological maybe.
Just say brain. Why can't we say brain?
Because it makes people think that I'm wanting to eliminate mental talk, and of course I'm not, because this is an essential part of how we are. It's again, look at it again. Talk about what's called folk psychology: belief, desire, explanations of human behavior. Now, some people thought that for these to be legitimate, they had to correspond to well-defined structures within the brain. They had to be actual, like some brain writing that wrote down like a list of things you wanted, a list of things you believed, and kind of consulted that list and then made a decision on the basis. And Dan said, "Oh, that's crazy. That's not how the brain works." But it doesn't mean we have to throw out talk of belief and desire. What this talk is doing is capturing patterns in our response to the world, capturing hugely complex sensitivities. To believe that what one is in Crete say is to have a whole complex set of dispositions to respond to the world. Most obvious one being to answer in Crete when someone asks you where you are, but there are a lot more. So it's a shorthand way of capturing a state of a immensely complex evolved system. Now, and I would say the same with talk about the mental. So I don't want to just imply that we can just tell it all in terms of neuron firings. And we need to explain. We need to have a global picture of the activity of these things. So I'm aware of the implications of that.
Yeah, but if we make an analogy, say, with the economy, so the economy is the sum total of trillions of transactions that are going on. Literally, that's all it is. But of course, we can talk about it at the macro, at the economic level, without any reference to those things. But no one would ever deny that it is due to those things. So what I'm trying to say is that you are kind of accepting that it is essentially the firing of neurons that is going to explain everything. Because what else is there in the brain apart from the firing of neurons, unless you're postulating some other things?
Well, let's look at it this way. I mean, this is a sense, I suppose, in which I'm a physicalist, that my interest is not so much in ontology as in explanation. I want good explanations of things. And if those explanations posited weird stuff, then fine. I just don't think we should import that weird stuff just because it appeals to us intuitively. So, I mean, if you look at my computer, I guess you could reduce it all to its physical elements, sort of so many grams of copper, so many grams of whatever molecule the plastics are, and so on. We could have these in a tray on the desk, and that's all that my computer is. Okay, and I suppose that would be worth a few dollars. And the trick is to get all those things organized into a way that they can do the wonderful things that my computer does. And that, of course, is a tremendous engineering feat that has involved hundreds of thousands of people over many, many years and so on. Again, if you could reduce the human being to piles of calcium and carbon and whatever, the trick is to get those organized into this wonderful thing. I mean, it is a genuinely wonderful, amazing thing. And there was a wonderful, amazing processes that created it, processes of natural selection over ultimately billions of years, processes of cultural evolution over over certainly tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of years, processes of individual development over, in my case, more years than I want to remember. That's what's arranged these things into. Now, they haven't, in doing that, added something fundamentally new ontologically.
Yeah, I get
Just
you.
as in building a computer, you haven't introduced a computerness to it all. That's a construction. Now, what's wrong with that picture? Why is that a degrading or diminishing picture of us? It's saying we're wonderful. We're made out of dust, which I think the Bible actually
Yeah,
does say.
I mean, I don't see, just going back to the kind of theist-atheist thing, I don't see that in itself as atheistic in any way. I mean, if there are many people who believe God created life through the process of natural selection, it was part of God's plan, and therefore, it doesn't seem a huge difference really to say that God created all of our mental faculties through a process of physical elaboration, which is quite clearly almost everything in our existence is related to physical stuff. I don't see that. That's not necessarily an issue. But coming back to the issue of going from building blocks upwards to the final thing. So as I said, some people will say that it doesn't matter how complex you make your computer or how intelligent you make your AI, it will never have that conception of I. Now, according to your theory, there's no reason why it shouldn't.
Yes, I mean, and the reason they think that is because at the heart of it, I think, is because they conceptualize their consciousness or their mind or themselves perhaps as something irreducibly subjective, something that is only accessible from the first person point of view, that cannot be studied or explained from a third person.
And that's an a priori kind of position. I mean, it's not evidence based, as we said.
Yeah, that's how they can see it. That's what I call the Cartesian, for want of a better word, paradigm. Now, I think that's quite compelling, and you can easily get yourself into that way of thinking. It might be even very natural. I just don't think it's the only option.
So just coming back to this self-model, I think, as you said, people fear this kind of loss of specialness or loss of identity by reducing it to material things. And you're arguing that there's no reason that there should be any loss of specialness. So in terms of things like identity, personhood, selfhood, you're saying that this in no way lowers the selfhood of a human.
Absolutely, 100%. In fact, I would say that it makes it more secure, because it doesn't just say it's something intangible and inexplicable. That's just, I mean, at what point in the development of the embryo is the soul? There's no way of answering that question, because you're just positing something magical happening at some point. I would ask that, at what point should we start to think of the fetus or the embryo as a person? And now, if you think of person as something that's constructed, you achieve personhood or develop personhood through natural processes. We won't find a bright line between non-person and person. We'll find a gradation, and it makes us think about what sort of things are important to us when we're talking about personhood, and how do those things develop. Okay? So it gives us a handle on the problem. We can start thinking about creative solutions to these questions, instead of just positing a line a bright line that we can never detect.
I know you didn't intend this, but is that in some way a slightly dangerous question, though? If we start getting to points of saying what constitutes personhood, I can see you're doing it from a kind of scientific perspective almost, but I mean, you could see if we get to a point where we say that a fetus has not achieved personhood because it doesn't have the same mental capabilities as, say, an adult. Would you agree with that?
I think it would depend. I think we need. I don't have a. This is not something that
Not strong.
I
I'm
thought,
just saying that
deeply about. It would depend upon what we consider important for personhood. We need to talk about that. And it's not. I don't think there's a scientific answer to that question. It's a question we answer as a community.
I'll show you where I'm going with it. A worldview that shows that every human has intrinsic value and fits the class of human due to its magical mystery soul or whatever it is, at least gives that to everyone. Whereas you could see that a materialistic point of view could lead to gradations of human. For example, people with learning difficulties could be seen as somehow having less developed personhood, or maybe as somebody who doesn't have learning difficulties. Can you see where I'm not saying that this is wrong? I'm just saying that can you see that there are routes that could be gone down?
Look, there are differences. If people have learning difficulties, then they have some difficulties. Okay, how we respond to those difficulties, whether we think that makes them less valuable as persons, that's up to us. We decide that. I don't for the moment think that. I think that it means that we should devote extra attention to helping them achieve the best they can given those difficulties. I think we should devote attention to helping them overcome it. We shouldn't just, I mean, you could equally turn the thing the other way around, as notoriously people have done, and said and debated who possesses this which
The
at what
right
stage
kind of
does
soul.
a fetus acquire a soul? Do other animals have a soul? There is no empirical way of determining this, so this just becomes entirely theory or ideology driven, and that I think is very dangerous.
Yeah, I think what I kind of just slightly got surprised at was that I feel it makes great sense to talk about a kind of sliding scale, but not to introduce categories of once you reach a certain amount, then it categorizes something else. But maybe I misunderstood what you're saying.
No, I don't think that there are very few bright lines anywhere in nature, and there are gradations. And then the point is, on the view that I'm the view that I have of these matters, these ethical matters, is not that science can settle them by any means. We settle them. We have to debate as a community. What science can do is give you all the relevant information. And the information being about the abilities and capacities of the creatures involved. How much we value that is up to us. I mean, not up to to sort of to choose on a whim, but to decide seriously as an ethical community.
This is I would say, a scientific theory. Would you say that it is falsifiable? And if so, how?
Science is continually changing its mind about things. That's the characteristic of science. For instance, one way in which this sort of view could have been easily falsified, I suppose, was by discovery of parapsychological abilities. There's a lot of investigation, serious investigation, this by scientists in the mid 20th century. Quite a few philosophers of mind were seriously interested in this and thought there was good evidence that that our metaphysics of mind needed to be adjusted to accommodate this. It turned out the evidence was just either the researchers were deluding themselves, or in some cases they were deliberately cooking the books. There's no good evidence of that. But yes, if there was something that couldn't be explained in the way that I propose in the book, then obviously we'd have to adjust. But it needs to be more. What the point is, my intuitions, or your intuitions, or anyone's intuitions about their own minds, I don't think count for very much. And this isn't to say that I don't trust you when you say something. I mean, you're giving me your honest report about your mental life. The point. Here's an example that Danny was talking. We talk about rotating mental images in our minds to solve a puzzle. Say, now, is something actually rotating in your mind when you do that? Is something actually turning around? Some people say, yes, I actually sort of kind of saw it in my mind's eye rotate. Well, but yeah, that's what you're inclined to say about whatever was occurring in your brain. That's, given the kind of access you have to whatever your brain was doing to solve the problem, that's what you're inclined to say, and you were sincere about it. And insofar as it's your description of your own state, that's fine. We give you a last word about it. But we don't conclude from that there really was something that actually rotated somewhere. That's a matter for further investigation. So don't call this hetero phenomenology. It's phenomenology, phenomenological reports of your own experience, but then is interpreted, then is treated as data for further theorizing. We don't accept it as the last word.
Just coming back to something you said a bit earlier, you said that you're a strong believer in free will, but there are neuroscientists which I'm sure you're aware of, who deny free will. I mean, they say that basically, if all the activity of our brain results from inputs to neurons, then those inputs, there was no choice in any of that. That was, sensory data or circuits within the brain that triggered those things, which then triggered further things. So free will, again, they would say free will is an illusion. Why do you think free will is not an illusion?
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by free will, of course. If you're meaning something contra-causal that can override the natural causal processes that can, to put it bluntly, make atoms move about in ways that the laws of physics don't permit them to, well, then no, I don't think free will exists in that sense. I think that's kind of...
No, but the idea that there's something like the I that decides, this kind of man in the cockpit who's deciding, is kind of slightly undermined by the idea that the man in the cockpit is nothing but a projection of much lower processes.
The point, the sense in which we are autonomous is that the processes, think about autonomy again on a sliding scale. To the extent in which your behavior is controlled by processes from outside you being the organism, and you don't have much free will. To the extent that it's controlled by processes inside you, and particularly processes that you as the organism have cultivated over a long period of time, it's coming from you. They're both causal processes, but somehow my causal processes are the ones that constitute me. They're my habits, my dispositions, my goals, the things that are... So they don't need to override the laws of physics. They just need to be ones that are part of me.
So you're assigning kind of moral responsibility at the level of the organism, but why could somebody not say, I have no moral responsibility because my brain made me do this?
Well, they could say that, but we wouldn't take them seriously.
So in society, we wouldn't accept it. As society,
because we need to think about what talk of free will is actually, and responsibility is actually doing for us. Now, insofar as that, some people, I think, see it as picking out a locus of completely unconstrained free choice, so that you are completely responsible for any bad things you do. That was down entirely to your evil nature and your wicked choice, and had nothing to do with the circumstances of your upbringing and perhaps the neurological problems you may have had or so on. I think that's a horrible conception of free will, a horrible way of thinking about blame and responsibility. We have to take account of all the influences that make people what they are and make them do the things they are. There's nothing we excuse them. They may have got themselves into such a state, either by their own lack of self-control or by unlucky genetics or upbringing or whatever, that they couldn't really do otherwise. And we should take account of that as a mitigating thing. But that doesn't mean that when people are operating under reasonably good conditions and have chosen some option that we find morally unacceptable, we respond to it. We don't maybe want some sort of metaphysical source of choice that is ultimately justifying retributive punishment. I'm not keen on retributive punishment. I think we should look at punishment as more as a way of helping people to do better, and of course protecting society. I still think there's use for talk about, if not free will with capital F and W with the small letters, or just to talk about autonomy, self-control, responsibility.
Or behavior, just behavior?
I think it's supposed to be more than that, because it's not just about what you did, but it's about why you did it and what prompted you to do it. Just overt behavior is just the surface. We need to look at what's happening beneath the surface. This is why behavioristic sort of conception of ourselves is so thin. It needs to be internal behavior. It needs to be what's going on. And also, we need to deconstruct this distinction between conscious and unconscious.
Yeah.
It's not the matter that we sort of separate ourselves entirely from the physical world and make conscious choices that then intervene. No, it's all conscious choices are shaped by unconscious influences. It's the sort of the sea is churning around inside us, and some bits of it come to the surface.
Some bits bubble up, yeah. I often see
some bits bubble up. We need to recognize what we are and then adapt our conceptions like responsibility and freedom to those things without throwing them away, and because the fact that we have them suggests they've been useful.
I think some of the critics of your position add implications which you're saying don't need to be added on.
absolutely. I would say that. I think this was true of Dan Dennett's work in particular. I think people simply, perhaps because he wrote so accessibly, they didn't really think hard enough about what he was saying, and so they just read it through and thought, yeah, I kind of got the idea. They didn't think hard enough. He was not asking us to, I mean, particular notions of responsibility. He had I won't say exactly conservative, but it was not it certainly was not a very radical concept. We need the notions of responsibility and autonomy. I thought they were crucial. He was just asking us to, if you like, set them on a better footing. And I think it's important we should do this because these notions are important to us. This is why I'm worried about religious justifications for certain things, because I think that's a sort of hostage to fortune. If you need to suppose that benevolence and kindness and decency and compassion and concern for equality and fairness and so on only make sense within a religious framework, then you're kind of saying, well, if you get disillusioned from that religious faith, you don't need to care about these things. I think it's exactly the opposite. I think these things are things that are crucial to being human.
Yeah, that's a kind of humanist position there. Yeah. Okay, just slightly changing tack.
Sure.
It's quite hard to see. Well, I think I can predict what your answer is going to be now. So, what's your view on some competing or theories of consciousness? So, for example, idealism. The idea that the fundamental ground is mental, and the physical world is really just a kind of mental representation of things. The illusion is that we're in a physical world. The thing that you took for granted at the start is in itself an illusion.
Well, first of all, you're going to, if you're an idealist, you're going to have to say pretty much everything that I say, because you're going to have to still tell this whole story about evolution and how it constructed these things. You're just going to add, but all of these are really just ideas in the mind of myself or of God or something. So when it comes to doing science and investigating the world and so on, we proceed in exactly the same way. Okay, so you just add this metaphysical foundation to it all. I don't see any point in that, because you're going to, if you develop that sort of story fully, if an idealist takes seriously the investigation of consciousness, if they're going to come to they might very well come to an illusionist view of consciousness. They might say that within the physical world, as it manifests itself to us, there are physical creatures who have the illusion of being phenomenally conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
They could accommodate that, I'm pretty sure, yeah.
They could accommodate that. Absolutely. So they could agree with me about consciousness as it occurs in the physical world. But then they still want to say, but nevertheless, even though this world is populated with beings who are firmly convinced that they are immaterial souls, for purely physical reasons, physical here being within the scope of the world as experienced, they notice they really are immaterial souls. It's like saying, look, we have a full explanation of why people think there are flying saucers, say, because you can explain it all in terms of atmospheric conditions or whatever. But they really are flying saucers, they're all the same. I mean, you've accounted for the phenomenon.
So it has a cost, yeah.
Well, and also just the only reason for doing this is because you want to hold on to this idea that you are directly acquainted with this inner world. And that it's the nature of that world and the nature of you and the nature of your relation to it are very, very special and not like anything that's in the physical world.
This links to something else I was going to bring in later. I'll bring it in now. Do you think that holding on to dualism is a form of egotism? It's a self-aggrandizement that you want to be more than what you're saying. The reason why I'm interested in this is that many Eastern philosophies are all about reducing the ego and coming to kind of in union with the world, or coming in union with a divine mind, but all about negating the ego as some sort of special thing, which has its, which you give priority to. I mean, compassion, all of that is about giving priority to other people rather than your own ego. I mean, do you feel that a materialist view of consciousness is helpful at curbing the human ego?
Yes, I do. And this is important to me, important to the project that I'm working on. First of all, though, I wouldn't suggest that the people who adopt the sort of views we're talking about, idealist views or whatever, dualist views, I don't want to speculate about their psychology or their character or whatever. They're saying they're egotist.
No, I wasn't trying to link
No,
it up with them.
I didn't think you were, but I did want to make it clear that I'm not too. That we all have all kinds of unconscious influences on us. But I do think that that emotionally, if you like, I don't like this idea of us all being locked into what I think is little sort of prisons of subjectivity from which we can never really escape, and which which prevent us ever really making contact with others. I like that idea. I think it's an idea I find. I mean, of course, how I find it, it doesn't matter at all in terms of assessing its value as a theory. But I find it an unattractive idea, a rather isolating idea, an idea that I think does elevate our individual status to a point that is actually uncomfortable, because then we become really worried about what happens, about the loss, the end of this private world, what's going to happen to it. If it is so special, then its termination would be a tragedy.
So you're saying that. So you're saying you might become less fearful of death with your.
It certainly helps me in that respect, in that death isn't going to be quite the catastrophe you think it is, because it isn't going to be the annihilation of a private world, of a world that has existed ever since you can remember, and that is the source of all that really matters to you, and that if you're an idealist, it incorporates the whole world. No, it's going to be a transition. It's going to be you're going to from dust back to dust, but that dust will then get rearranged in other places.
Yeah, I was going to say, does that make you actually more in tune with nature then? Because if our whole existence is, as you said, from dust back to dust, do you feel more part of the world, more part of the universe in some way, not some other realm?
I do know whether that's a disposition that I already had, and I found this view congenial to it, or whether the view that I adopted on theoretical grounds is helping cultivate that disposition in me. I don't know. I don't have that degree of insight. But yes, the two mesh nicely together for me.
Yeah, I mean, we said that at the beginning, that the inferences that we make and what we think is the best explanation are often aligned with things that we
absolutely
are afraid to admit, but you are admitting.
But I do find this this is important to say, that in opposition to the way many people see the sort of view that I've been articulating, I find it, let's use the word spiritual, if you like, fairly.
Why do you hesitate to use the word spiritual?
Because it might imply that I'm talking about something dualistic. I mean, I want to use it in an informal, gesturing at a bunch of responses to the world and attitudes to the world and a way of thinking about the world. Okay, so I don't want to say in the sense that involves literal spirit. Okay, so let's say spiritual. I find it congenial. I find it uplifting. I find it comforting. I find it intellectually enlightening. So there's no conflict here. There's no science-religion conflict here. No science-spiritual conflict here. Okay, they're just different ways of responding to the reality that we live in. One is seeking to understand it. The other is seeking to respond to it. And they mesh on the kind of view that I've been talking about. There's no conflict. There's no, is it this or is it that? I don't like dualisms at all, generally. Nature doesn't deal in bright lines very much at all.
Another kind of trendy view of a consciousness is panpsychism. My guess is you're going to say, I'm going to predict, you're going to say that's taking a bad problem and making it even worse. Is something like that?
I've actually, well...
Sorry, we should just explain to listeners. Sorry, we should just explain to listeners before we start. Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is some sort of attribute of every aspect of reality, down to atoms and leaves and bugs and toilet paper and everything, and the universe. Not to lessen this at all. It's a serious theory. Yeah. So.
Well, let me just in defense of panpsychism, it's not necessarily leaves and toilet paper and so on that are conscious. What is conscious are the fundamental constituents of reality, whatever they may happen to be. So subatomic particles, or I don't know, perhaps that's the quantum wave function, I don't know. The idea is that it's there right at the fundamental level of reality.
But then also all the way up as well.
Well, not necessarily all the way up, because it's certainly all the way up in that it's there in the constituent part. But the idea is that it only... So there are micro consciousnesses everywhere, micro consciousnesses, like there are atoms everywhere. But only in certain cases do those micro consciousnesses combine to form a large scale macro consciousness like you and I have. Okay. And so this is the combination problem.
Yeah.
How, first of all, how on earth does that happen? And secondly, where does it happen? Does it happen? I guess it does in other mammals. Does it happen in fish? Who knows? Does it happen in insects? Don't know. Does it happen in tables? Probably not. Most panpsychists wouldn't want to say that a table has a consciousness of its own, qua table, though it's made of lots of little consciousnesses, the atoms that make it up. So they wouldn't want to say which makes it quite an inelegant theory in that respect, because we've still got this problem of where consciousness, the macro consciousness, kicks in. My attitude to it is that I think I wrote a paper on this called Panpsychism and the de-psychologization of consciousness. For once you de-psychologize consciousness, you treat it as something intrinsic, an intrinsic feature of things, rather than something that can be understood in terms of what it does, its functions. Once you do that, then panpsychism actually starts to look like a fairly elegant way of developing that view, because why should only human brains have this extra dimension? That is, if you like, un-Darwinian. We know that complex things are formed out of simpler things. So the idea that this complex consciousness that we have is composed of simpler ones is, to that extent, a more elegant view, especially if you can provide some intelligible account of how the composition happens, which is where the thing breaks down. So I said that if you take that step at the beginning into trusting your intuitions about consciousness as irreducibly subjective, then this is an interesting way to go. But then I pointed out at the end that it has so many problems that it's more or less, it serves as a reductio of the whole thing. It shows you why it's best not to go down that road.
Yeah.
Because that's where you end up.
Yeah, so what you're saying is it's a solution to a problem we didn't have in the first place. Yeah.
Yes, but quite an elegant solution to that problem.
Yeah. And the other thing is, which I haven't understood, although I don't know much about it, is when you're talking about micro consciousnesses, haven't you changed the meaning of the term so much that it's actually not right to use the same word for it anymore?
I agree, because this is the part where the de-psychologization I was talking about. I think as soon as you de-psychologize consciousness, you've removed it from the function that this talk normally has. For instance, pain. Pain matters because of what the effects it has on us. Okay, pain pushes us and pulls us around in all sorts of really quite. You can feel what the pain is doing to you. It's raising your heart rate. It's causing your stress levels to rise. It's doing stuff to you. It's physical pain. Now, if you see, now pain is there are all those physical things happening, but there's also this intrinsic awfulness to it that is something else. Now, I actually have a little thought experiment. I say, well, okay, suppose you're in pain. You could take two different anesthetics. One would relieve all the physical symptoms. You wouldn't feel stress. You wouldn't believe you were in pain, because that is an effect of being in pain. Your attention wouldn't be focused on wherever the pain is. You would be free to think and talk about anything you wanted. You wouldn't have any emotional responses. All of the different psychological and behavioral responses to pain don't occur, but the intrinsic awfulness is still somehow there. And then the other one does the opposite. It removes the intrinsic awfulness, but all of the other stuff is happening. You're stressed, you're focused, you can't think about anything, you feel a great need to try to reposition yourself. You can't focus, you're constantly complaining and crying out and so on. Spell all this out, all these psychological reactions out in enough detail. But then say, of course, but in this case with this anesthetic, the intrinsic pain isn't there. Well, it seems to me, I think if you tell this picture richly enough, and that's the difficulties in telling it richly enough, then you see there's nothing left for the intrinsic thing to do. So yes, I think that as soon as you think of consciousness as something that an atom could possess, then you're thinking of it as something that's different from what we're talking about.
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is just I'm just going to tell you a little personal anecdote now.
Sure.
One of the things that actually makes your theory kind of very compelling to me is having watched my father deteriorate with neurodegenerative disease. Because there was a point in that when I felt he has gone. No, the person that I knew has gone. But of course, if you had a dualist thing, you couldn't say that, of course, because his soul is still there. Yeah. But everything that made him who he was had definitely gone. So And what, of course, had gone was neurons. It was bits of brain that had gone. Yet I definitely felt that he had gone, and that kind of was like the opposite way of the evolution. It's kind of the degradation of the consciousness. And of course, you do get to a point where everyone would say that you're not even conscious anymore. When you get this moribund kind of state, which doesn't seem to react, and you can just track this on a brain scan. So does that ring true to you?
Yeah, it does, and I think it's it's incredibly sad to witness something like this, but observe it in yourself. As I'm getting old now, and as I'm observing this, I'm observing right now the deterioration of my own ability to talk, to find words. I'm struggling to find words. You can see it. That's not because my soul has the words, but is having difficulty transmitting them to my language center. It's because I am. My language center is part of me, and the whole organism, is struggling to activate it and to get it activated in the right ways. So I actually exemplified the point there in trying to describe it. Yes, and I think the idea that there must be a soul present in a patient like that is actually quite a cruel one. So they have somehow.
There's a great line from that film. It's a Robin Williams film.
I'd like to be them. What are they thinking?
Awakenings. Is it Awakenings?
Oh, right, yeah, so Oliver Sacks film, yes.
The virus didn't spare their higher faculties.
I think one of the doctors says something like, do you think that they could be kind of aware of everything, conscious of everything? And the doctor says, no.
We know that for a fact.
And he says, why?
Because the alternative is unthinkable.
It's
so horrible to think of that, we don't want to, like you said.
I mean, there are cases of locked-in syndrome. I think that's the right word. But again, they are not completely inaccessible to us. They're not. Their behavior is not observable to somebody just looking at them. But you can see that there are certain neural processes occurring, and you can work out what they are doing. So there is the behavior isn't just restricted to the stuff you can see. We can sort of behave inside. We can focus our attention on something. And you can ask people with this condition, and one way to communicate with them is to ask them to imagine something, like imagining a tennis match. And you can see that regions associated with visual imagery are being activated. So you're getting them to behave internally. But if they can't even do that, if they can't respond to requests to do things internally, in their minds, then what is there to relate to? Where is the person they've dissolved?
And this has implications for end-of-life care and so on. Yeah,
it does, and it doesn't make the decisions for us. But what's optimistic about it, I think, is that all the relevant information is available to us. All the relevant empirical information is available to us, in principle, with the right investigatory techniques, and then we can, as a community, we can decide what we think is best. We can take the moral attitude. The sort of dualist position says, no, there are some facts of the matter here, determinate facts about whether there's a real, soul present there, but we can never really know them. All we can do is turn to the philosophers and say, come up with some theory about this. And of course, the philosophers don't agree at all.
And the interesting thing is that the doctors are making those decisions that you just talked about based on the empirical evidence that they have in front of them about whether there's somebody there or not all the time. End-of-life doctors, they're having those conversations with the families. And interestingly, even theistic doctors kind of accept it in that scenario.
They have to, because there's no other way of doing it. There's no agreement among theologians and philosophers, dualistic philosophers about this. And it ultimately becomes a matter of, I think it's rather great, it becomes a matter of sort of intellectual taste, whether you're a panpsychist or an idealist or whatever. The thing is, everyone has to deal with these questions about investigating the natural world. Even if you have an idealistic conception of what it really is, if you think it's just ideas, you've still got to deal with investigating it. That's the central point of all of it. The question is whether you want to add some metaphysical overlay to it.
Okay, Keith, we're coming to the end. Could you just give us a single takeaway message from your work in this field?
Oh, there's one that I used that I have on my website and that I've used and that Dan liked. In fact, I wondered when I came up with it whether he might have Dan Dennett, might have been the one who originated it, and I was just imagining that I'd thought it up. But I asked him, and he said, "No, you've come up with it." And so it was this: consciousness is like a rainbow. It's real, but it's not quite what it seems. It's not a multicolored arc located at some spatial temporal position in the sky. It's an effect on us of the sunlight reflecting from the water vapor in the air between us. The sunlight has to come from behind you, of course. So it's our response to the atmospheric conditions. And I think that our notion of consciousness is sort of our, as an organism's response to our detection of certain things that are happening in us. It's how we model ourselves, how we respond to what's happening in us. It's real, though, very real. Rainbows are real. They're just not what we think they are.
Keith Frankish, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.